Can you believe the grocery items we once tossed in our carts are now completely banned? In the 1970s, these everyday foods filled shelves, lunchboxes, and family dinners without a second thought. What changed so much that something so normal could vanish overnight? Back in the 1970s, it seemed like every sweet you could get your hands on was bursting with bright colors. Red dye number 2 was the superstar of the candy aisle, painting gumdrops, lollipops, and jelly beans in shades that looked almost too bold to be real. Kids loved it because it made candy look like a rainbow you could actually eat, and parents barely gave it a second thought. The truth was, no one cared much about what was going into the treats, only that they were cheap, sugary, and kept kids quiet for a while. That all changed when studies started raising questions about whether this dazzling red was doing more harm than good. Suddenly, something as innocent as a jawbreaker had the shadow of cancer fears hanging over it, and shelves that once looked like a carnival started looking more muted and plain. What once felt magical now carried a stigma, and candy makers scrambled to reformulate with safer dyes. The memory of that shocking red still lingers in the minds of anyone who grew up licking it from their fingers. It is strange to think that something so simple could go from everyday fun to outright banned in just a few short years. In the 1970s, a whole wave of diet sodas promised a slimmer waistline without giving up fizzy sweetness. The secret was Cyclamate, a chemical sweetener that slipped into lemon-lime cans and cola bottles with barely a mention on the label. People saw it as a miracle. Finally, soda, without the guilt. Cyclamate was cheap, effective, and had no bitter aftertaste like the sweeteners that came before it. Housewives stocked it in their pantries, teenagers gulped it after school, and it became the quiet backbone of the diet food craze. Then came the bombshell. Lab tests on rats showed shocking cancer risks, and overnight, something that once seemed like the future of soda became a headline about danger in your glass. Soda companies scrambled, shelves shifted, and the era of Cyclamate came to a screeching halt. What was left was a mix of confusion and betrayal, because millions of Americans had already been drinking it daily without a clue. It is unsettling to realize how fast a trusted product can turn into something forbidden. It might sound unbelievable today, but many cans on supermarket shelves in the 1970s were actually sealed with lead solder. That means the metal holding the can together could leach dangerous particles right into the food you were about to eat. Beans, soups, fruits, vegetables, almost anything in a can carried that silent risk. Families opened those cans without hesitation, pouring dinner straight into pots or onto plates, never guessing the hidden hazard built right into the container itself. At the time, it was cheaper and easier for manufacturers to use lead in the sealing process, and no one questioned it. Slowly, science began catching up. Doctors started to connect the dots between mysterious health issues and the everyday products people used without question. The idea that the same cans you relied on to stretch a budget could be poisoning you from the inside out was a terrifying realization. By the late 1970s, regulations began tightening, and eventually, lead solder in canned goods was fully banned. It is chilling to look back and realize how close to danger everyday families really were. They seemed like the perfect treat, a hollow chocolate egg with a toy hidden inside. For kids in the 1970s, it felt like opening two presents at once, a sweet snack and a surprise you could play with after. Kinder. Surprise eggs came from Europe, but quickly found curious fans in the United States. Parents saw them as harmless fun, and children begged for them at every grocery trip. The problem was buried inside that chocolate shell. The small plastic toys were a choking hazard, and reports of accidents sent regulators into action. Suddenly, what once felt like magic was now a banned item in American stores, though it continued overseas without interruption. It left many American kids with a sense of missing out, especially when friends or relatives from abroad brought them back in suitcases. For those who tasted one before the ban, the memory is bittersweet, a symbol of childhood joy that was taken away almost as quickly as it appeared. How could something so simple be both delightful and dangerous at the same time? Few food scares hit as hard as the PBB disaster in Michigan during the 1970s. A mix-up at a chemical plant sent polybrominated biphenyls, or PBBS, into cattle feed, and before anyone realized it, the meat hit grocery store shelves. Entire families were unknowingly buying toxic beef, cooking it up for dinner, and feeding it to their children. For months, the contamination spread quietly, with no warning signs at the butcher counter. When the truth came out, it was nothing short of a nightmare. Thousands of cattle had to be destroyed, and trust in local meat all but collapsed. The scandal was so severe it pushed lawmakers to tighten food safety rules across the country. For the people who lived through it, the memory is not just about bad beef. It is about betrayal, about realizing the system that was supposed to protect them had failed. To this day, PBB contamination stands as one of the darkest food safety stories in American history. In an era when dieting became more mainstream, jams and jellies sweetened with saccharin looked like the perfect solution. Spread it on toast, spoon it into yogurt, and enjoy all the sweetness without the calories. Housewives and health-conscious shoppers filled their cupboards with these diet jams, thinking they were doing something good for their families. Then came the warnings. Studies linked saccharin to bladder cancer in lab animals, and suddenly those innocent jars of fruit spread became suspect. The government stepped in, banning the use for a time before eventually allowing it back with strict warning labels. For consumers, it was confusing and frightening. One moment saccharin was the miracle sweetener, the next, it was a possible carcinogen. Many families tossed the jars out, while others quietly finished them, unwilling to waste food they had already bought. It became one more reminder that even the simplest comforts could carry hidden risks. Summer in the 1970s meant sticky fingers, melting popsicles, and neon colors that seemed to glow under the sun. Those eye-catching shades often came from azo dyes, a class of artificial colors that gave treats their unforgettable brightness. Kids loved the electric blues and fire engine reds, and parents rarely questioned what was behind them. At the time, bright colors were marketed as fun and harmless, the kind of thing that made summer feel magical. Few realized those same colors were the result of chemical shortcuts rather than natural ingredients. The truth, however, was less cheerful. Studies began linking certain azo dyes to hyperactivity in children and potential long-term health risks. What had once been sold as harmless fun turned into a controversial additive under fire. Regulators eventually banned several of these dyes, forcing companies to dial back the neon glow of childhood. For many who grew up then, the memory of those rainbow popsicles is tied to long afternoons and sticky smiles. But beneath the nostalgia lingers an unease. If something so simple could be banned, what else in the freezer carried risks we never knew about? Bread has always been a staple in American kitchens, but in the 1970s, even something that simple carried hidden risks. Farmers used mercury compounds to treat seeds, protecting crops from fungus before planting. The problem came when trace amounts of those chemicals made their way into harvested grain and, eventually, into bread. Families slicing into a fresh loaf had no idea they were taking in something toxic. For decades, bread was considered one of the safest, most reliable foods, so the idea that it carried invisible danger shook people deeply. It forced families to question whether the government was truly protecting their most basic foods. It was not the kind of hazard you could taste or smell, but the damage was very real. Mercury exposure carried serious health risks, and the discovery sent shockwaves through food safety circles. Once the link was clear, the practice of using mercury seed treatments was banned outright, closing the door on one of the most unsettling chapters in everyday food history. For many who lived through it, the idea that even a slice of bread could be unsafe still feels shocking. Bread was supposed to be the most dependable food of all. Walk into a supermarket in the 1970s, and you might have seen raw milk sitting in the dairy section, sold right alongside pasteurized cartons. Shoppers picked it up without thinking twice, pouring it into cereal bowls and coffee cups the same way they always had. Raw milk had a reputation for being natural, wholesome, and closer to what farmers drank themselves. For many, it was seen as a return to simpler times, when food felt less processed and closer to the farm. That sense of nostalgia blinded people to the very real dangers hiding in every bottle. But what most people did not realize was that it also carried bacteria that could make people gravely ill. Outbreaks linked to raw milk forced regulators to act, and one by one, states began banning its sale in grocery stores. Suddenly, what had once seemed like the purest option became a symbol of hidden danger. Today, raw milk is tightly controlled, with sales prohibited in many states. For people who grew up drinking it, the ban still feels surprising. It was just milk, after all. Or so they thought. In kitchens across America, powdered drink mixes were a quick fix for thirsty kids and busy parents. Add water, stir, and you had a pitcher of brightly flavored refreshment ready to go. In the 1970s, many of these mixes used Cyclamate to keep the sweetness high and the calories low. The cheerful commercials made it seem like the perfect choice for families, promising all the flavor without the guilt. Television ads showed smiling children gulping down colorful drinks, while parents were told they were making the healthy choice. The truth, hidden in the fine print, was that the sweetener was far more dangerous than anyone realized. But when Cyclamate was banned over cancer concerns, these powders suddenly became part of a growing food safety scare. Companies pulled them from shelves, and parents found themselves wondering what exactly they had been serving their kids. The idea that even a simple glass of fruit punch could be dangerous was enough to shake confidence in the entire processed food industry. What was once seen as harmless family fun turned into yet another banned memory of the decade. If you walked into a candy shop in the early 1970s, the rainbow on the shelves was not complete without the deep purples and violets that came from FD and C Violet No. 1. This dye made icings brighter, hard candies shinier, and gave gumdrops their striking jewel tones. For kids, the color was unforgettable. It was the taste of grape lollipops, the shade of party cakes, and the shimmer of sugar-coated jellies. Parents bought them by the bag without a second thought, happy to keep birthday parties festive and lunchboxes colorful. But behind that cheer was a dye that would soon come under fire. Studies began connecting FD and C Violet No. 1 to cancer in lab animals, raising questions that no candy lover wanted to ask. The Food and Drug Administration could no longer ignore the evidence, and what once seemed harmless became a forbidden shade overnight. Candy makers scrambled to reformulate, but the absence of that rich purple was noticed immediately by children and adults alike. The joy of a grape candy suddenly felt a little dimmer, and many who grew up with those treats still recall the exact look of that vanished violet. It was a reminder that even something as innocent as a color could hide a danger. Today, candy still comes in every shade imaginable, but for those who remember, the loss of Violet No. 1 is tied to a time when the brightest parts of childhood became a little darker. Ice cream in the 1970s was not just about indulgence, it was about reinvention. The rise of diet culture meant dessert companies rushed to offer a scoop that felt guilt-free, and the magic ingredient was Cyclamate. Suddenly you could open your freezer and find diet sherbets, frozen yogurts, and ice creams that promised all the sweetness without the calories. For families trying to cut back, it was like striking gold, creamy, cold, and seemingly healthy. Kids still licked cones, parents still bought pints, and few stopped to question what was making it sweet. But science had already begun whispering a warning. Studies showed cancer concerns, and the dream of endless diet ice cream began to melt under scrutiny. One by one, companies pulled the Cyclamate-laced products, leaving consumers confused and even angry. Imagine eating bowls of dessert for months, only to be told it might not be safe after all. It shook trust in frozen foods, and it left diet seekers wondering what they could believe. For many, the memory of those safe scoops is tinged with irony. They were a symbol of health, yet banned for the very risks they were meant to avoid. It proved that sometimes the sweetest things can carry the bitterest truths. Chewing gum in the 1970s was more than a treat. It was a lifestyle. Kids chewed it in school, teenagers popped it at drive-ins, and adults used it to freshen breath on the go. When sodium cyclamate entered the scene, gum makers saw their chance to dominate the sugar-free market. Packs of gum boasted fewer calories and dentist-approved smiles, and suddenly it seemed like everyone was chewing without the guilt. The flavor lasted longer, the stickiness felt modern, and the trend spread quickly. But when cancer concerns hit cyclamate, gum was not spared. Shelves that once carried endless rows of colorful packs suddenly lost entire product lines. Children who had grown used to blowing bubbles with their favorite slim gum found it gone without warning. Parents who trusted the sugar-free promise felt betrayed. Even more unsettling was the thought of how many sticks had been chewed before the risks were known. It was not just about losing gum, it was about losing trust in the idea that new meant better. Gum remains popular today, but the memory of those banned sticks lingers as a reminder that even the simplest habits can carry hidden costs. Breakfast in the 1970s was a ritual built around cereal boxes stacked in every kitchen. Kids poured them into bowls by the handful. Parents grabbed a quick serving before work, and the sugary mascots promised energy for the whole day. But many of those cereals carried preservatives in high doses, BHA and BHT. These additives were meant to keep cereals crisp, colorful, and long-lasting, and for years, no one thought twice about it. A box could sit on the shelf for months and still taste fresh. Yet when studies began connecting BHA and BHT to health risks, the trust began to crumble. Consumers wondered if their morning ritual was quietly doing harm, and headlines only fueled the fear. Cereal makers pushed back, arguing the doses were safe, but the damage was done. By the end of the decade, reformulations began, and the loud claims of now safer only made families more suspicious. Imagine being a parent and realizing the food you thought was wholesome for your children had been filled with questionable chemicals. It cast a shadow on one of the happiest parts of the day, the sound of cereal hitting the bowl. Even now, people look back on those bright boxes with nostalgia, but also unease. Before pasteurization laws tightened, grocery store shelves often carried raw fruit juices in large glass jugs. They looked fresh, farm-style, and natural, a wholesome choice for breakfast tables across America. Parents poured it into glasses with pride, convinced they were giving their families something better than processed juice. The taste was sharper, fresher, and less sweet, making it feel even more authentic. But what no one saw were the invisible dangers, bacteria, contaminants, and risks that pasteurization was designed to eliminate. As outbreaks of illness began to rise, regulators moved to stop unpasteurized juice from being sold so casually. Families who had grown up drinking it were shocked. The idea that something as simple as apple juice could be unsafe was almost unthinkable. Yet the reality was clear. Fresh was not always better. For many, the memory of those big jugs is tied to mornings at the table, but also to the moment they realized that natural does not always mean safe. The ban felt like a loss of tradition, but it was also a wake-up call. The 1970s were a time when the shine on supermarket fruits and vegetables did not just come from nature, it often came from pesticides like orthocyclo. Farmers sprayed it widely, believing it was the best way to keep crops pest-free and plentiful. Shoppers never suspected the crisp apples, leafy greens, or tomatoes carried residues of chemicals meant for insects, not people. At first, these sprays were praised in magazines and even promoted as helping America feed more families for less money. Home cooks proudly served these picture-perfect vegetables, never imagining the chemicals stayed behind long after the bugs were gone. It took years of research and advocacy before the truth began to outweigh the marketing. For families, the produce looked perfect, and that was enough. But when regulators began studying the long-term effects, the picture turned grim. Health risks, contamination, and environmental damage became linked to pesticides that once seemed essential. The ban came quickly, but the trust took years to rebuild. For many who grew up then, the memory of glossy fruit in the produce aisle is bittersweet. It was affordable, abundant, and colorful, yet hiding dangers no one wanted to see. It is sobering to realize that the healthiest foods in the basket were sometimes the most compromised. Clove gum was one of those niche favorites that you either loved or hated. Its sharp, spicy bite stood out in a world dominated by mint and fruit flavors. In the 1970s, manufacturers leaned heavily on artificial clove oils to create the taste, a cheaper and easier method than relying on natural spices. For a short while, clove gum was marketed as something sophisticated, the kind of gum adults would chew after dinner instead of a mint. Some kids even pretended it made them seem older, just because the flavor felt unusual and strong. It had a small but passionate following that swore it was better than anything else on the shelf. For gum lovers, it meant a bold new flavor that lingered longer than peppermint and felt a little exotic. Kids often traded sticks at school, and adults carried packs in pockets as a quirky alternative to the usual. But when questions about the safety of synthetic clove oil surfaced, the tide turned. The Food and Drug Administration raised concerns about toxicity and potential long-term effects, and the product vanished from shelves. For fans, it was like losing a secret treat that only a few really appreciated. The gum became more than candy. It became a lost piece of the era's bold experimentation with flavors. Today, clove gum exists in niche corners, but the artificial oil versions remain banned. The memory of that intense bite is a reminder that sometimes boldness comes at a price. Toward the end of the 1970s, food science was buzzing with the promise of fat-free snacking. Enter Alstra, a fat substitute that promised all the crunch of chips without the calories. In early testing and limited releases, it looked like the future of snack food. Magazines hailed it as a miracle, and companies poured money into marketing, convinced they had cracked the code to guilt-free eating. For dieters, the idea of snacking endlessly without gaining weight sounded too good to pass up. It quickly became one of the most anticipated food experiments of the decade. Families could enjoy a bag of chips without guilt, and diet culture embraced it with open arms. But the reality was far less appetizing. Alstra caused serious stomach issues, from cramping to embarrassing digestive problems. Reports began piling up, and what was meant to be a breakthrough quickly turned into a public relations disaster. By the time it was banned, Alstra chips had already left their mark, both on grocery shelves and on the digestive tracts of those who tried them. For many, the memory is not just about chips, but about how easily hope can turn to regret. It was a lesson that shortcuts in food often come with hidden costs. Supermarket coolers in the 1970s carried neat rows of veal in vacuum-sealed plastic packs. To shoppers, it looked modern, clean, and convenient, a sign of progress in food storage. But many of those veal cuts came from calves treated with growth hormones designed to boost yield. For ranchers, hormones were sold as an easy way to keep up with rising demand, especially as more families turned to veal as a cheaper alternative to beef. Ads rarely mentioned the treatments, leaving consumers with no idea of what was happening before the meat reached the shelves. What seemed like a simple, trusted protein was anything but. At the time, few questioned it. Meat was meat, and families were happy to buy whatever stretched the budget. But concerns about hormones in food began to mount, with health advocates warning about long-term effects on consumers, especially children. The glossy packages no longer looked so harmless when whispers of risk grew louder. Eventually, restrictions tightened, and hormone-enhanced veal disappeared from shelves. For shoppers who had trusted the coolers, it felt like another betrayal. They had been buying convenience, but hidden inside was something far more complicated. The ban left veal with a stigma it still has not fully shaken. Apples that gleamed like glass, cucumbers that shined like plastic. This was not nature's work, but the result of coatings like polyvinyl alcohol. Supermarkets in the 1970s embraced the practice, believing shoppers wanted produce that looked flawless. The waxy coating sealed in moisture, extended shelf life, and gave fruits and vegetables an appealing glow. For grocers, it was a dream solution. Less spoilage meant less waste and more profit. Shoppers often associated shine with freshness, so sales actually went up when the coatings were used. Almost no one stopped to ask what that shine was really made of. Families bought them without question, believing shiny meant fresh. But regulators soon realized that ingesting polyvinyl alcohol coatings carried risks no one had considered. Bans were put in place, forcing stores to rethink how produce should look. For consumers, the shift was noticeable. Fruits no longer sparkled quite the same, and the grocery aisle lost a bit of its manufactured perfection. Yet the loss was also a gain: produce that was safer, even if less glamorous. Looking back, it is almost eerie to think how easily we accepted food that had been literally painted to shine. In the 1970s, spray cheese felt like the future. Kids marveled at the push of a nozzle that turned a can into an instant snack, and parents loved the convenience of spreading cheese on crackers without dirtying a knife. Grocery stores lined shelves with rows of those shiny cans, and they became a common sight at family parties, game nights, and even in school lunches. What many did not realize was that those early aerosol cheese formulations were loaded with nitrites. At the time, nitrites were a popular preservative, used to keep foods colorful and fresh-looking. They gave that cheese its familiar golden shade and helped it stay shelf-stable for months. But as studies mounted, the risks began to overshadow the convenience. Nitrites were connected to the formation of carcinogens inside the body, and suddenly the playful push of a spray can seem far more sinister. For many families, the discovery was jarring. How could something sold as harmless fun carry such hidden danger? Grocery stores phased out the old formulas, reformulating to safer alternatives, but the damage to trust was already done. To this day, spray cheese carries a reputation as junk food, a symbol of the era when novelty came before safety. Looking back, it is impossible not to remember the laughter of kids spraying towers of cheese onto crackers, only to realize later that what seemed like innocent fun was another banned experiment in convenience. Few candies from the 1970s stir as much controversy as candy cigarettes. On the surface, they looked playful, little white sticks that puffed sugar smoke when kids blew through them. For children, it felt like copying the grown-ups, pretending to be just like mom or dad who smoked after dinner. Parents sometimes even encouraged it, brushing it off as harmless fun. But what many did not realize was that early versions of these candies were laced with tiny amounts of real tobacco dust. It was marketed as flavoring, a way to mimic the authentic bitterness of a cigarette. That meant children were unknowingly inhaling and ingesting tobacco particles while playing pretend. At the time, the dangers of tobacco were just beginning to enter the public conversation, but to think kids were being exposed at such a young age was staggering. Once the truth came out, outrage followed. Candy makers were pressured, laws were written, and the product vanished from shelves. For children who grew up with those candies, the memory is confusing. It was both a game and a risk, something playful that carried a hidden cost. Today, candy cigarettes still exist in novelty form, but the versions with real tobacco dust remain a chilling reminder of how blurred the lines once were between candy and vice. It was proof that not everything wrapped in sugar was sweet. The 1970s were full of do-it-yourself food kits that promised to bring fun into the kitchen. One of the most popular was Rennet tablets, sold in small boxes with instructions for turning milk into pudding or custard. Parents bought them eagerly, seeing them as an educational and wholesome way to teach kids about food. The process was simple. Dissolve a tablet in milk, let it set, and watch the magic of science turn into dessert. Children were fascinated, and for a time, rennet pudding was a kitchen project nearly every family tried. But beneath the fun was a problem. The tablets were made with enzymes sourced from the stomach lining of calves, something rarely explained clearly on the labels. Parents who thought they were buying a simple dessert mix later discovered they had been serving something far more complex and unsettling. As concerns about labeling and child safety grew, regulators began to crack down. Parents demanded transparency, and eventually the tablets were pulled from shelves for home use. For many who grew up then, the memory of stirring rennet pudding is tinged with unease. It was a childhood science experiment with an ingredient no one fully understood. It stands as an example of how even the most innocent-looking products could hide truths that families never expected. In the 1970s, grocery shelves were stacked with sodas in every flavor and color imaginable. Tropical Fantasy Soda promised something different: bold flavors, bright dyes, and prices so low that anyone could afford them. For working-class families, it became a favorite, a way to enjoy a sweet treat without breaking the budget. Kids loved the vibrant colors, from neon orange to electric green, and parents welcomed a drink that kept everyone happy for pennies. But those colors came at a cost. The early formulas of Tropical Fantasy used dyes that were later deemed unsafe. Rumors began to spread about side effects, and soon the soda's reputation was in free fall. Some stories were exaggerated, even bizarre, but the core issue was real. The dyes had no business in food. Regulators stepped in, forcing the company to reformulate. The soda survived in name, but the taste and appearance changed forever. For many who grew up drinking it, the ban felt like losing a piece of their youth. Tropical Fantasy became less about refreshment and more about controversy, a symbol of how quickly cheap could turn dangerous. It is remembered today not just for its price, but for the uneasy truth hidden in every bottle. Breakfast cereals in the 1970s were a cultural force, with mascots, commercials, and boxes that doubled as toys. Among them were puffed rice cereals marketed as diet-friendly, boasting fewer calories while still tasting sweet. The secret was Cyclamate, a chemical sweetener that had already taken over sodas and desserts. Parents thought they were making a smart choice, giving their children something light and healthy before school. The commercials pushed the same message, showing happy kids spooning down bowls of puffed rice with milk. But the promise of guilt-free sweetness crumbled when cancer concerns about cyclamates reached the public. Suddenly, that innocent bowl of cereal was no longer so harmless. Families who had trusted the packaging felt deceived. Grocery stores pulled the boxes, and parents went back to questioning every label in the aisle. For kids, it was the memory of a cereal that vanished almost overnight, a reminder that even breakfast, the most trusted meal of the day, could be compromised. The ban turned puffed rice cereals into more than just food. They became symbols of an era when science raced ahead of safety. Looking back, it is hard not to wonder how many mornings began with a spoonful of risk. Frozen fish sticks were once a weeknight hack. You could feed the family, serve them with fries, and still come in under budget. The box was big, the sticks were crispy-ish, and no one asked what kind of fish it actually was. You dipped it in ketchup or tartar sauce and called it done. That box that used to cost $3? It is closer to $7 now. And the sticks are smaller, thinner, more breading, less fish. Even the bargain brands have gone up. And it is not like anyone thought frozen fish sticks were top-tier cuisine. They were there for the nights when you had no energy, no plan, and no money. But now, they are part of the inflation club. You still eat them, you still sort of enjoy them, but you cannot ignore the price anymore. Even fake fish got expensive. Boxed gelatin mix, store brand, no frills, was the dessert you made when there was not enough for anything else. It cost pennies, took only water, and could sit in the fridge for days without going bad. Red, orange, lime green, it all tasted mostly the same. But that did not matter. It was cold, wiggly, sweet, and strangely satisfying. You poured it into mismatched bowls, let it set, and waited for that first satisfying spoonful. It was something you could offer guests and still feel like a good host. It filled space at birthday parties, potlucks, and school lunches. You could stretch it with canned fruit or whipped topping, turn it into a salad if you wanted to get fancy, or just eat it straight. Sometimes you made it just because you needed to feel like something was under control. It set slowly in the fridge, and for a few hours, you had something to look forward to. Gelatin mix did not impress anyone, but it held its place. Colorful, sweet, and just enough to count as dessert. The regular Lincoln logs were already something special. Those smooth, notched pieces of wood that clicked together into cabins and forts, every kid loved them. But the giant Frontier set? That was a whole different league. This thing came in a massive box, filled to the brim with hundreds of logs, roofs, chimneys, and all the accessories needed to build your own village. Not just a cabin, a settlement. And rich kids had them all. They would dump the whole set onto their clean playroom floor and start building like pioneers with a trust fund. The rest of us maybe had a small tin with a dozen pieces that barely made a fence. But the giant Frontier set? You could make entire battle scenes. It had extra long logs, green roof slats, plastic figures, even little horses and wagons. These were not just toys, they were a historical reenactment in your living room. The box said, ages 4 and up, but you needed a good 15 feet of floor space just to use the whole set properly. Rich kids would invite you over, let you build one wall, then take over. It was always their fort, their rules. And even though you told yourself it was just wood, it still felt like they had more imagination just because they could build more. That is what these sets did. They made creativity feel like something you had to buy in bulk. Canned tripe was another 1940s grocery item that feels unusual today. Tripe, the stomach lining of cows, was inexpensive and high in protein, making it a wartime staple. Canned versions appeared on shelves, marketed as ready-to-cook or pre-cooked convenience meals. Some recipes suggested frying it with onions or stewing it with tomatoes, trying to make the chewy texture more appealing. Immigrant families who were already familiar with tripe often embraced it, but for others, it was a jarring new addition to the dinner table. Advertisers tried to market it as hearty and wholesome, but no slogan could make it popular with kids. Ads promoted it as traditional, nutritious, and thrifty, even though many Americans had never eaten it before. Recipes for tripe stew or fried tripe appeared in community cookbooks, showing how homemakers adapted to make it palatable. The texture was chewy and the flavor polarizing, but families learned to live with it. Some immigrant communities already enjoyed tripe, but for many others, it became a strange necessity of the times. Once the war ended, canned tripe quickly disappeared, leaving behind memories of one of the most unusual proteins of the decade. Cabbage and potatoes by the sack were the backbone of poor family meals. Sold in bulk for cheap, they could be stretched into soups, stews, or fried up for dinner. Bags of potatoes sat in cool basements, while cabbage heads lingered in the fridge for weeks without spoiling. Every meal seemed to find a way to use them, boiled, mashed, fried, or shredded into coleslaw. Kids groaned when cabbage smell filled the house, but parents knew it was hearty, filling, and nutritious. Sometimes it was all you had, but it was enough to keep everyone going. In winter especially, potatoes and cabbage carried families through when money was thin. They were humble, unglamorous foods, but they held a place of honor in poor households. Every poor kid in the 1970s remembered those giant sacks, knowing dinner would almost always include one or both. Store-brand American cheese singles were the cheapest cheese you could buy. Plastic-wrapped slices that melted like magic and turned any sandwich into comfort food. You used them on grilled cheese, cheeseburgers, or even scrambled eggs if you were in a mood. You used to get 20 slices for under $2. Now the same pack costs over $4 and feels thinner than ever. It tears when you peel it, it sweats when it is warm. But you still buy it because it makes the food feel like home. You stand in the aisle comparing slices, wondering if it is worth going generic again. Spoiler: even the generics are not cheap anymore. Cheese singles used to be filler food. Now they are another reason your grocery total feels like rent. These things were loud, literally and figuratively. Custom name belt buckles became a full-blown trend in the 1970s, and if your name was shining in metal across your waist, you were automatically cooler. They were chunky, shiny, and spelled out exactly who you were. And trust me, only certain kids wore them. The ones whose parents took them to the mall and said, "Pick anything you want." These buckles were not just about fashion, they were about identity. In a time before social media, this was your personal brand, worn right at the center of your body. You would walk into school and bam, there it was. Tony, Michelle, Jason, like a name tag that you had to earn. It said, "I matter." It said, "Look at me." And more than anything, it said, "I am not afraid to shine." Most of us could not afford them. Maybe you had a plain belt. Maybe you had no belt at all. But the kids with custom buckles, they made sure you saw them. They would tug their shirts up just enough, stand with hands on hips, or lean against lockers so that metal gleamed in the hallway light. It was all for show, and it worked. Store-brand peanut butter crackers were the kind of snack that showed up when lunch was still a few hours away. They came in little plastic sleeves, bright orange crackers, sandwiching a thin layer of slightly sweet, slightly salty peanut butter. You could buy a box of 6-packs for under $1, and they lasted all week if you were careful. They were crumbly, dry, and left peanut butter in the corners of your mouth. But you never said no to them. They were the treat tucked into a lunchbox when cookies were out of reach. You ate them slow, one bite at a time, trying to make them last, or you scarfed them down fast because hunger had no patience. Some broke in the package. Some were perfect, but everyone counted. They were the in-between snack that got you through school days, grocery trips, or waiting for dinner to be done. You never thought of them as luxury, but looking back, they were one of the most dependable little things in your pantry. Peanut butter crackers did not make a meal, but they gave you just enough to keep going. Soy Victory sausage was one of the strangest meats to line shelves during the 1940s. With real meat in short supply, companies blended soy flour, fillers, and scraps into sausages that were meant to stretch rations further. These sausages often looked the part, but once cooked, they revealed their odd texture and flavor. Many described them as rubbery or bland, but they were cheap and filling, and that mattered more than taste. The government promoted them as patriotic, urging families to embrace soy as a way to help win the war. Cookbooks included recipes that added onions, breadcrumbs, or herbs to improve the flavor. Families learned to slice them into casseroles or stews where the strangeness could be hidden. For many, it was their first real exposure to soy as food, and it stuck in memory as both peculiar and necessary. Soy sausages never became a beloved staple, but they were a symbol of sacrifice at the dinner table. Carnation. Instant breakfast was marketed as nutrition in a glass, but poor kids knew it mostly as a sugar rush before school. The powder was mixed into milk, promising vitamins, minerals, and energy, but mostly tasting like chocolate milk with extra grit. Parents loved it because it was fast and cheap, filling kids up in minutes. The powder never fully dissolved, leaving clumps at the bottom of the glass that kids stirred endlessly with spoons. Strawberry, vanilla, or chocolate, all of them packed with sweetness that got you out the door buzzing. Mothers bought it in bulk, convinced it was a healthy shortcut, even if it was closer to dessert than breakfast. For kids, it was better than cereal some mornings, and for parents, it was one less thing to worry about. Today, people laugh at the idea of calling it instant nutrition. But in the 1970s, Carnation Instant Breakfast was a grocery item every poor kid remembered with a mix of nostalgia and sugar-coated energy. Instant mashed potatoes used to be the cheapest way to fake real comfort. Just add water, maybe some butter, and suddenly you had a side dish that looked like dinner came together on purpose. They were shelf-stable, family-sized, and cheap. $1 or less for a box that lasted weeks. Now those same boxes are $2 or $3, and the portion sizes have somehow shrunk while the price tags grew. Even store brands have edged up into "wait, what?" territory. And that is not even counting the loaded kinds with cheese or bacon flavoring. They are practically deluxe now. For people who used to grab 3 boxes without blinking, that is a shift. It means thinking twice about something you once relied on, something that filled your plate when there was not much else to serve. Sure, they are still fast, still easy, still kind of taste like cardboard fluff, but the good kind. But now they are a backup plan with a budget. Even fake potatoes are not cheap anymore. The Light Bright itself was already a showstopper. Plug it in, stick colored pegs into a black screen, and watch your artwork light up. But here is the kicker. Most kids only had the basic set. Rich kids had the extra refill packs. That meant more templates, more colors, more options. Unicorns, rocket ships, zoo animals, you name it. The refill packs were not cheap. You had to buy them separately, and once they were used, that was it. No do-overs. They had enough pegs to make a Light Bright zoo, a Light Bright city, a Light Bright universe. Their templates were rotated weekly, like gallery installations. Meanwhile, your set still had 2 missing red pegs and a sun that was mostly blue. So most of us rationed them like gold. 1 template per month maybe. But if your family had money, you went through them like printer paper. You would visit a friend's house and see 10 finished light bright templates pinned to their bedroom wall, full gallery mode. And meanwhile, yours still had that same flower pattern you made 6 months ago. But even if you did not have the extras, you still loved the idea. There was something special about watching your design light up in the dark, even if it was the same one every time. Boxed gelatin mix, store brand, no frills, was the dessert you made when there was not enough for anything else. It cost pennies, took only water, and could sit in the fridge for days without going bad. Red, orange, lime green, it all tasted mostly the same. But that did not matter. It was cold, wiggly, sweet, and strangely satisfying. You poured it into mismatched bowls, let it set, and waited for that first satisfying spoonful. It was something you could offer guests and still feel like a good host. It filled space at birthday parties, potlucks, and school lunches. You could stretch it with canned fruit or whipped topping, turn it into a salad if you wanted to get fancy, or just eat it straight. Sometimes you made it just because you needed to feel like something was under control. It set slowly in the fridge, and for a few hours, you had something to look forward to. Gelatin mix did not impress anyone, but it held its place. Colorful, sweet, and just enough to count as dessert. Powdered gelatin desserts in odd flavors became another strange feature of the wartime pantry. While fruit-flavored gelatin had long been popular, the 1940s introduced savory flavors like tomato, celery, or even chicken. These powders were marketed as creative ways to stretch meals, turning leftovers into molded salads or aspics. Government pamphlets even included recipes for gelatin meat salads, showing off peas, carrots, and even hot dogs floating in wobbly shapes. Magazines praised them as thrifty, modern, and attractive, though many families quietly dreaded serving them. Children in particular were baffled, expecting dessert but finding vegetables inside. Homemakers were encouraged to suspend vegetables, meat scraps, or even fish inside jiggling blocks of gelatin, creating bizarre dishes that baffled children and guests alike. The idea was efficiency, nothing wasted, everything served. Cookbooks filled with recipes for salads that combined gelatin with mayonnaise, peas, and carrots, insisting they were both nutritious and elegant. In truth, they were strange, often unappetizing, and today they are remembered mostly as culinary curiosities. Few recipes from this gelatin craze survived beyond the wartime years, but the memory of tomato-flavored gelatin lingers as one of the oddest items ever sold in grocery stores. Puffed rice or puffed wheat cereal was another grocery item poor kids could not forget. It came in giant plastic bags, so big they barely fit into the pantry. The cereal itself was bland, light, and tasted like cardboard without help, but it was cheap and lasted forever. Mothers dumped heaps of sugar on top just to make it palatable, turning breakfast into a half-sweet, half-grain ritual. Kids would crunch through mountains of it, sometimes soggy, sometimes stale, but always there in the morning. The sound of that oversized bag crinkling was part of every poor family's kitchen soundtrack. It did not come in colorful boxes with prizes or mascots, but it filled bellies for pennies. Families bought it by the sack because it stretched across countless mornings. Looking back, it might not have been anyone's favorite, but it was dependable, and every poor kid remembered it. Canned ravioli and spaghetti were never fancy, but they were hot and filling. Open a can, dump it in a pot or microwave, and you had a hot meal in minutes. Kids loved it, adults tolerated it, and the price, under $1, was the real selling point. Now, a single can can hit over $2, and the multi-packs that used to be budget savers now look like gourmet bundles. Even the off-brands have started creeping up. You buy less, you stockpile on sale, you debate whether lukewarm pasta with mystery meat is really worth that much. But you also remember the comfort, the weird satisfaction of biting into one of those soft, sauce-filled pockets. The sauce was never great, but it was familiar. Now it feels like even childhood food nostalgia comes with a price tag. You used to joke about canned pasta. Now it is laughing back. It looked like something from a spaceship. The Polaroid SX70 was the first folding instant camera, And when you saw someone snap a photo and watch it develop in seconds, it felt like magic. Rich kids did not just take pictures, they made memories on demand. You had to pay for the camera and the film, which came in little packs that were just as expensive as the camera itself. Most families did not mess with that. Too pricey, too fragile, too much of a risk. But for the kids who had one, it was a golden ticket to popularity. At birthday parties, school trips, sleepovers, you knew who had the camera. They would pass the picture around as it faded into life. Everyone would huddle around like it was a crystal ball. And even if the photo came out blurry, it still felt special. Because you could hold it. You could pin it to a wall or tuck it into a notebook. It was proof that you were there. That moment belonged to you. Unless, of course, you were just standing on the edge of the photo, half in, half forgotten. Canned applesauce was dessert, side dish, and lunchbox filler all in one. It came in big cans, small cans, even plastic cups toward the end of the decade. It was smooth, sweet, and slightly tangy, and always better cold. You served it with pork chops, spooned it into bowls, or spread it on toast. Sometimes it was cinnamon-flavored, sometimes plain, but always familiar. It was fruit that required no peeling, no chewing, and no mess. You stirred it before serving because the water always rose to the top. It came out in a soft plop and sat in the bowl like a scoop of mashed fruit. It cooled your tongue after hot meals and added sweetness to otherwise dull plates. Sometimes it was the only thing on the plate that felt like dessert. You never got excited about it, but you always finished it. Kids loved it. Adults used it. It was dependable. Canned applesauce was one of those foods that never tried to do too much, but always gave just enough. Canned horse meat stew was one of the most controversial and strange protein sources of the 1940s. Beef was in short supply, but horses were plentiful, and some companies began quietly selling canned horse meat as stew. For many, the very idea was unsettling, but wartime hunger softened resistance. Ads framed it as a noble choice, with slogans like, "Every bite helps the fight," trying to make eating horse feel patriotic. In some areas, butchers openly sold horse cuts, though they were labeled carefully to avoid scaring buyers. Those who ate it often avoided telling neighbors, embarrassed by the stigma. Ads promoted it as affordable, hearty, and patriotic, encouraging families to see it as just another type of meat. In truth, it was stringy, tough, and carried a flavor most Americans did not embrace. Yet in some areas, especially on the West Coast, canned horse meat found a market. Families who tried it rarely admitted it, but the tins sold steadily enough to be remembered. Once the war ended and beef returned to shelves, horse meat vanished almost overnight. It remains one of the strangest chapters in American grocery history. Coffee cans for storing flour or sugar were a sight you could find on any kitchen counter. Once the last spoonful of Maxwell House or Folgers was brewed, the metal can was scrubbed clean and filled with dry goods. The plastic snap-on lid kept everything fresh enough, and the can itself was nearly indestructible. Poor families stacked them on shelves, labeled with masking tape and marker to tell sugar from flour, rice, or cornmeal. No matter how many times they were washed, they always carried that lingering coffee smell, which sometimes flavored the flour if it sat too long. But nobody minded. It was thrift in action, and that mattered more than taste. Kids grew up recognizing the sound of those plastic lids popping open as part of the rhythm of cooking at home. They doubled as storage for nails, screws, crayons, or buttons, making them as much workshop and craft supplies as kitchenware. Lined up in neat rows, they became a badge of pride, practical, reused, and full of possibility. Buying new canisters was out of the question when every household already had a pile of coffee cans ready to go. Margarine in a tub was the cheaper answer to butter, and for a long time it stayed in its lane. It spread easily, kept forever in the fridge, and came in tubs big enough to last all month. You could bake with it, fry eggs in it, melt it over vegetables, or slather it onto toast. Some people swore by it. Others just could not afford anything else. Either way, it got the job done. For years, you could get a whole tub for under $1. Now that same tub is pushing $3, and if you go for a buttery spread or something with olive oil, forget it. You are still getting oil and flavoring, but paying like it is whipped gold. The ingredients have not changed, but the price sure has. The basic brands that once saved you money are now neck and neck with store-brand butter, and that makes it harder to justify. For a while, margarine felt like a recession-proof staple, something you could count on in lean times. But today, it feels like you are being charged more for settling. It still lives in fridges across America, but now it comes with a side of frustration. When even margarine feels expensive, you start to wonder what cheap even means anymore. These were not just toys. They were explosions with permission slips. Model rocket launch sets in the 1970s were the holy grail of cool. You got a tube, some fins, a nose cone, and most importantly, a real engine. You could build it, paint it, and watch it launch hundreds of feet into the sky. But they were not cheap, and they were not sold just anywhere. You needed adult supervision, wide open spaces, and money for replacement engines. That meant most kids never got to launch one. Rich kids, though, they had the whole setup. They would bring them to school science fairs or launch them at the park on weekends with their parents filming from the sidelines. You could hear the countdown and your heart would pound, even if it was not your rocket. It was the kind of moment you would remember for the rest of your life, just watching. The blast-off made you feel like something bigger was always just out of reach. The rest of us just stood back, hoping to feel the whoosh as it lifted off. And when that rocket cracked through the clouds and left a trail of smoke behind, it felt like freedom, like possibility, like everything you wanted but could not quite reach. Soy Victory bread was yet another patriotic twist on grocery shopping in the 1940s. With wheat rationed and demand high, bakers added soy flour to bread dough to stretch supplies. It was promoted as healthier, more nutritious, and part of the war effort. Posters proudly declared, "Eat soy bread, save wheat for the front," tying every slice directly to the fight overseas. Some homemakers swore by its denser texture, but many admitted that the flavor was heavy and unappealing. Children often complained that it was nothing like the soft white loaves they had grown up with. Loaves looked familiar, but the taste was slightly off, described as heavier and denser than regular bread. Ads told families that eating Victory bread was a way to help win the war, making every slice feel symbolic. Homemakers served it proudly, even as children turned up their noses. For some, it was their first encounter with soy as a staple ingredient. Once the war ended, soy bread faded from shelves, replaced by the fluffy white loaves people had missed. Victory bread is remembered today as both strange and deeply tied to the sacrifices of the 1940s. Glass peanut butter jars reused as cups were another trademark of poor family kitchens. Brands like Skippy and Jif often sold their spreads in heavy glass containers that doubled as drinking glasses once emptied. Mothers washed them out carefully, peeled off the labels, and suddenly you had a set of sturdy cups. Kool-Aid, sweet tea, or plain tap water tasted just as good out of a peanut butter jar as it did out of any fancy glassware. Some jars even came with printed designs, cartoon characters or logos that made them more fun than anything store-bought. Kids claimed their favorites, and God help you if a sibling drank out of your peanut butter glass. They rattled in dish racks, thick enough to survive endless drops, and often outlived real glasses that broke in a year. Families never wasted money on drinkware when they were essentially handed out for free at the grocery store. They were heavy, practical, and often mismatched, but that was part of their charm. Guests drank from them without complaint because everyone had them, and everyone understood. In poor households of the 1970s, those jars were proof that nothing useful ever went to waste. Cream of mushroom soup used to be the unsung hero of 1,000 casseroles. It was not something you ate on its own, but it was the base of every budget recipe your mom made from a church cookbook. You poured it into green beans, poured it over rice, or mixed it into tuna noodles and called it dinner. Back then, it was under $1, always. Now, closer to $2, and that is if you are lucky. Some stores price it like it is homemade French bisque. You used to toss 3 or 4 into the cart without thinking. Now you scan the shelf and hope for a 2-for-1 deal. And it is not just mushroom, cream of chicken, celery, broccoli. They are all climbing like they forgot who they were feeding. For generations, these soups were budget stretchers. They glued together ingredients that had no business being called a meal. But now they are part of the problem. Casseroles just got more expensive. Looking back at these banned grocery items reminds us how much times have changed. So share the one that shocked you most in the comments. Give this video a like if the memories hit home, and subscribe so you never miss another trip through food history.